some have already come in. Oh, we heard that. Some have already come in, but if you want to ask one, try and post it in chat for the panelists, and we will try and get around to them. I don't know how many we'll have time for. We'll just have to do our best on that. Okay, so now on to the candidates. They're all signatories of Labour Women's Declaration, all committed to upholding women's sex-based rights. And the order in which they're going to speak is Jennifer Smith, Ruth Woodhall, Morgan Fackrell, and Claudia Sorin. So can I hand over to Jennifer first, please?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for dialing in. So my name is Jennifer Smith. I'm a candidate for the National Women's Committee. I'm coming to you live from Bury North, which is the constituency that I live and that I'm heavily involved in constituency work. As like the other candidates, I've been thinking a lot about what to say, how to come across, a little bit nervous. But I suppose it's just a symptom of how important it is, really, this committee, and what a journey we've been on already to get through to nomination stages, get through to conference, etc. My particular path really comes out of a lot of the work I do at constituency level. As a women's officer, I've been women's organiser, branch chair, quite heavily involved in campaigning, local campaign forum. And I know it's not an easy ride for women in the party. I want to see this committee put through some big changes to help women self-organise in the party, which currently doesn't exist. It might say on paper that we can have a women's forum, but the party doesn't actively encourage us as women to get together in our constituencies, across our regions, etc., and come together on issues of policy and organisation. And actually quite often we're thwarted by the party itself and the structures within it. And I see this committee as an opportunity to change that atmosphere for women and change how we organise. I've been on quite the wrong end of stick and backlash, etc., from my local party, because I stick up for women in the party. A few years ago, some women councillors were experiencing bullying from the party leadership, and having gone through the correct channels to region, raising complaints, etc., nothing was happening. So we decided, as the Women's Forum, as it was then, to go public, to press the button, basically. As you can imagine, that didn't all go down quite so well. And as women's officer, I was the main target for any backlash. They went through my social media, putting complaints to region, stopped me from going to meetings, etc., etc. But really, what the response should have been was to actually take on board what the women were saying at the time, because now we find ourselves in a really sticky situation in my constituency. Next year, there is what we call all-out elections. So every seat in every ward is up next May, and we don't have enough women coming forward to take these roles, to come forward as candidates. The party, through region, is trying to fix which ones are all women shortlists. They're trying to put ridiculous deadlines on, coming forward for the panel, those kind of things. And it's incredibly frustrating to try and organise that. And without region on side, it's very difficult to make any progress and to make that change. So what I want to see for this new committee, something I will be doing, a very practical step, is to have every region that has a role specifically dedicated to the women in that region. Something that someone that will actively facilitate the meeting of women's officers, the connection to each other, the sharing of best practice, forums where we can get together and talk about issues across our constituencies. Because what I find is, whenever I speak to a woman in a different constituency, we're sort of telling each other the same story about, how difficult it is to organise, or what's happened to us when we've put our hand up and said something and tried to challenge the party. I see this committee really having to encourage that every constituency should have a women's branch, and actively pursue that with the constituency chairs, with the local campaigns forum, or what it's changing to now, because we can't gain the votes of women if we aren't there representing those women in our constituency. And if people outside the party ask about it, I'm always really honest and just say, well, no, we don't have enough women. Do you want to do it? No, they don't want to do it. They don't want to come forward either. Women have so many amazing skills that isn't necessarily linked to how many doors we've knocked on, because we organise all the time. That's what we do in our jobs, in our roles as carers, whether that's for other, people in the family or our own children. We're naturally capable of doing so much, but the party keeps pushing us back. And I want to see the committee facilitate that organising for women, and make sure that in 2 years' time, I'm not still in this position again of being a women's officer in a constituency with no contacts with any other women's officers, no progress made with motions that I've put forward, no progress made with the local campaign forum. It's really hard going to keep going back and saying the same things all the time. This is why it isn't working. I have solutions to what would happen. And if you work with me, I can, along with lots of other women, we can make it a better place. So that's sort of what I want to say, really. I take a very practical view of what this committee should be doing, particularly for us candidates here today. We're here to represent constituency parties. The committee will be made up of union women, women from the PLP, all NEC, all across the party, and that's important. But the constituency roles are really important, because that's the grassroots women. That's who we need to be speaking to, that's who we need to hear from, and that's who the committee should be organising for. So I if successful, that's something that I really want to work on. And I worry about there's quite a lot of candidates obviously in the running, some of them part of slates. I'm happy for people that they're on a slate and they've signed up to certain things, but I question why you'd want all 6 roles taken by one particular slate. I think the strength of the committee will come from different voices within that committee, able to discuss and debate with each other, and come from different experiences. So far from trying to contact other candidates or listen, there's been other meetings and things, I'm not hearing much about practically what those candidates are saying they'll do, other than representing a slate. I don't want to see that happen. I want to see women of all parts of the party be part of the discussion and be part of the management and organising within the party. So that's something that I will be doing. Thank you very much for listening. I'm really looking forward to your questions and having discussions, because I'm sure most people know a lot more than me in this room, and I'd really like to take our collective knowledge and move that forward as the committee is established. So thank you very much for listening. Hand over to the next person.
Ruth, thank you, Jen.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to say that actually, first of all, I completely agree with everything that Jen said, and Jen and I actually have been cooperating on this kind of level of actually helping to set up actual branches in time for this conference. And I have to say that East Midlands is one of the more cooperative areas. In fact, it's not been so difficult here, but I think actually these difficulties might actually be, it's partly because, for example, a lot of our CLPs are really tiny, so they're not quite so, in a rural area, they're tiny, they're not, we don't have people having built such great power bases. But still, the process, I agree with her that what we need is to build lots and lots of branches and network the women together, because that's the only way it's going to work. A system doesn't work unless you network everybody together. But the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm not going to go into the details. I'm going to actually go into the political argument for the women's organising. So I'm here because I think that autonomy is fundamental to women's organising, and LWD is the only group that is actually autonomous and 100% female with signatories in the race. So we're not actually a slate because we only signed up for women's autonomy, not for lots of other policies, but we have that commitment in common. Now, I normally vote for the left slate and its recommendations, but I feel that for the National Women's Committee, both the left and the right slates women are deeply compromised by the need to please or placate the men in their organisation in order to get on board. So that's why I prefer this commitment. So as I say, there's a purely political argument for women organising themselves independently as a single class, which has intersections inside it, and excluding all males, no matter how they identify. Now, this is a thing that's really unpopular, but it's a political argument. Yeah? If we assume a materialist left-wing position, this class consists of people who are born female and then undergo, well, at that point, sorry, we're all identified as a natural resource by society for reproduction. It's not that we identify ourselves by our genitals, which is the commonly very offensive insult that's being used. It's that society identifies us as a reproductive resource. We're babies, we don't identify by our genitals. So that's Engels' argument, in fact, yeah? So when people sort of talk about us being right-wing and reactionary or whatever, this is Engels' description of women. We then undergo a very intensive process of social conditioning to make us less resistant to exploitation as a resource, which is what Simone de Beauvoir wrote 800 pages about in The Second Sex. So I think most people probably have been too lazy to read it, you know. Anyway, now in the Labour Party, contrary to both of our rules, both our rule book and the law of the land, women have been effectively banned from talking about this structure, this power structure in society. They've been suspended, they've been excluded, and so on. Now, we've just had a series of court cases which have been won by women and by women's organisations. And actually, these are very similar to the kinds of court cases that the unions have been winning lately. It's like when your only method of regaining your rights is through the courts, that's the one you take. So actually, it's a very similar process that's going on. Right, politically, it's very important to exclude men from women's groups and meetings because all the evidence shows that men dominate mixed groups. It's not even always by force. Right? I'm a linguistics graduate. I studied sociolinguistics. It's actually the result of social conditioning. However, when women do break the rules and speak up or speak out of turn, as they think, we often meet very open disapproval, sometimes from men and women, because there's a sense of a sort of subconscious sense of a set of rules. Yeah. So when men are there, the dynamic changes. Some topics are never raised, and some topics are glossed over because we don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable. And women are very good at not making, conditioned to not make people feel uncomfortable. So this means that women's priorities and women's experiences are never identified, and they certainly never rise to the top. So we remain the second sex. So this is the political argument for women's organising, which people have seemed to have forgotten in the Labour Party. So I think that, my fellow candidates here and I, because of our independence and our commitment to autonomy, we offer something different and something better to the National Women's Committee. I think we're in a much better place to insist that the Labour Party complies with the law as far as possible. These are laws which we made, the Labour Party made, yeah? And we have to do it as fast as possible. Otherwise, we are heading straight for another humiliating investigation by the EHRC about institutional discrimination against women in the party, just in time for the next election. So we can't afford to do that again. We did it over anti-Semitism. We don't want that happening again, but it will happen. People are planning it already. So right now, because of the judgment against the ONS, the operation of gender self-ID inside the party conflicts with the Equality Act 2010. We're not allowed to do it, but we're still doing it, right? We can commit, as Keir did, to changing the GRA. A party can commit to anything in the future, but we can't act outside the law right now. So unless we get to grips with this situation very fast, we could see the absolute end of this party. If you think about the last EHRC investigation and what it did to us just before the election, we could be in that again. So, you know, what I'm going to say is for left-wing women, it's not much of a party, but it's the only one we've got. Those who remember that song. And I think that with much higher participation by women, which is what Jen was outlining, plus a handful of fearless and committed women on the National Women's Committee, we can do much better than this.
Thank you, Ruth. That was great. Thank you. Okay, Morgan, next.
Oh, hi. I'm Morgan Fackrell, and firstly, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come and meet me and my fellow candidates. And I have to say, I fully support and hold the same attitudes and the same aspirations as my colleagues. Working with grassroots Labour women members will be the foundation and guiding principle of my work if I have the honour of being elected to the Women's Committee. I've been a grassroots community activist and campaigner most of my life. I learned my activism within the women's liberation, lesbian and gay rights and animal rights movements, and putting my beliefs and value system into action working in the third sector has been a privilege. And especially the last 13 years, leading Cardiff Women's Aid, developing a feminist-led specialist service provider was everything that I hoped it would be. But enough about me, you can check out more on my campaign website. I want to talk to you about one of my priorities, and it probably won't come as any surprise that I want to talk about violence against women and girls. We do things a little differently in Wales with the Labour government, and our legislation and approach is broader than just domestic violence. We have violence against women legislation, and commissioning has to be carried out within a national framework addressing all areas of violence against women. I was a member of the third sector working group that advised Welsh Government on that legislation. It wasn't everything we hoped it would be, but it was certainly a massive step in the right direction. My Labour-run local authority commissioned gender-specific violence against women services, and I had direct experience of that commissioning model, both through its development, lobbying for what it should look like, and then the commissioning process itself, and my organisation as we won the tender. I believe I'm the only Welsh candidate across the board, and as such, the Welsh perspective is something I can uniquely bring to the work of the committee, alongside my direct experience of developing and delivering women's services. One thing that is no different across the UK, indeed across the world, is that there is an ongoing epidemic of violence against women and girls, and it shows no sign of decreasing. I don't need to spell out to you how this violence and abuse manifests itself in the lives of women and girls. You are all already politically aware enough. Most recently, we've seen the Ofsted report shining a spotlight on what many of us already knew was a toxic, sexualized culture that our children and young people have been handed by a society that fails to recognize the damage that a sexist and deeply misogynistic culture creates. Nor do I need to lay out the statistics about rape and sexual violence, the dangers of so-called honor-based crimes or forced marriage, or the number of women and girls coerced or sold into pornography and sexual exploitation. You are engaged activists and you already know this. These issues, however, must stand high on the agenda for the new committee. However, we do have our own issues within the Labour Party around misogyny and the undermining of hard-won women's equality that the new Women's Committee must address, and I'll come back to this issue later. Now, while a Labour government in Westminster would hopefully drive through some more impactful legislation on all issues of women's inequality, and in particular violence against women and girls, as a movement, we can do incredible work at local level. Labour-run and controlled local authorities commission local and regional services, and as such, they are the real change makers, or the people who are destroying an already fragile specialist women's sector. In Westminster, the Labour Party holds the Tory government accountable through the committee system and in the Lords, and they work to improve legislation and influence the work of government. The National Women's Committee must do the same, not just within the party, but also where the party has power and influence. Working with community groups, service providers, Labour activists and survivors, the committee can audit what our Labour local authorities and police and crime commissioners are delivering on the women's safety agenda. And it can provide overwatch on the development of best practice guidance for the commissioning of violence against women and girls services and policing priorities. We know sex-based violence against women and girls is a deeply rooted cultural issue, fueled and promoted by male privilege, patriarchy, and gender stereotypes, which means we have to have a holistic social change, which will need strong, focused leadership across civil society and at all political levels of influence and decision-making. And this brings me to the issues within our party around misogyny, sexism, and the legacy of paternalism that the Women's Committee must address. The Women's Committee must ensure that all forms of sex-based abuse and threats of violence are condemned loudly wherever they occur within the party structure, and that Labour Party members are properly censored for attacks on women members who are stating their legitimate beliefs related to women's safety and equality. We can no longer accept business as usual, and I want to see the Women's Committee as the guardian of a woman's right to state her views and beliefs in a safe and respectful environment. And finally, the committee has to put women's rights and women's safety first and champion that position within the party. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. Thank you. And our fourth, Claudia.
Hello, everyone. It's tricky coming last because I know I'm probably going to cover some of the areas that have already been covered, but I'll do my best. I'm Claudia Sorin, and I'm standing as a candidate for the National Women's Committee. I remember going to an anti-austerity march in 2011. At the time, I wasn't a member of any political party, but I was very angry and wanted to do something to stop the Tories and their destructive plans. A couple of years later, I joined the Labour Party, determined to make a difference. I was disappointed at how few women were active in my local party at that time. However, I threw myself into it, hoping I might be able to encourage more women to get involved along the way. I took on roles, canvassed, campaigned, and stood as a candidate. More women did step forward with support and encouragement. But we can't just focus on elections. It's community activism where women are leading and where women are engaged. Relentless cuts to public services and LA budgets have impacted women most. Those who depend on these services and those who work in them. I see the role of the National Women's Committee as supporting women to set up women's branches, engaging with them so that the Labour Party becomes women-centred and women-led as women members inform policy making. Women's branches will also be important in reaching out to women in their communities. And this will be through campaigning on local issues, providing a welcoming environment for women where no one is afraid to ask questions, where meetings and events are designed to fit around women's lives. where taking part digitally is an option, and where children or other dependents can be included. This will increase women's participation and raise Labour's profile locally as we campaign on the issues that matter to people. The number of times I've heard on the doorstep or on street stalls, women say they're not interested in politics or they don't know enough about it. Yet when it comes to community campaigns where they can see positive action taking place, then they're really keen to get involved and support them. I have big hopes for the women's organising in the Labour Party, but change is desperately needed as the party is losing touch with women and internal party processes are putting barriers in our way. Why can't you set up a women's branch if your women's forum hasn't been ratified? Why is it not one woman, one vote for the National Women's Committee? Women's officers are not able to network or contact members easily. Women are being silenced and reprimanded for speaking out on the impact of self-ID on women. So what's needed is strong democracy and greater transparency. On the National Women's Committee, I won't be pushing my own or any other faction's agenda. I'll represent you, the women members. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Claudia. That was great. Before we go into the questions, I want to address just a couple of things most of us have been thinking about this week. And firstly, Maya's victory, which we've already mentioned, and which makes it clear that we have a right to hold our gender critical views and the belief that sex is immutable. This should strengthen our hand in our dealings with the party and our repeated attempts to get them to address the mistreatment of women in the party, which is something LWD has been working on for a long time. It may even make legal action a possibility, and we will be discussing that at Labour Women's Declaration and listening to some of the women who've suggested that we try and move forward in that direction. Secondly, Keir Starmer's statement in support of self-ID, which he made this week, standing in a field looking very lost, I might add. It's not only us who are angry about that. We understand that quite a few women MPs are also very unhappy and that they are going to be meeting with him. He has called for a blank slate policy review, starting from scratch, basically. We think self-ID must go through this review, and we're hopeful that if it goes through proper scrutiny and equality assessments, then it will not survive that process. We will have gender critical women on the National Women's Committee, at least 2 of them. And Anne Henderson, in her previous work, made a lot of proposals to improve democratic channels for women, and some of those proposals are now being implemented. Along with that, and Maya's judgment, there's every reason, we think, to hold the line and to stay hopeful, because change is coming. And then thirdly, I just want to mention this. Both Lesbian Labour and Labour Women's Declaration have been refused permission to have a fringe meeting at the Women's Conference. Now, I'm not sure exactly what we're going to be doing about that. Lesbian Labour is looking at challenging that in any way that they can. And we will be discussing that on Tuesday this week and seeing where Labour Women's Declaration goes with that. So those just 3 of the issues that I know are sort of fairly burning issues that we did want to mention rather than ignore. So I'm going back now for questions. And the first one, in fact, relates to Maya's judgment. It's from Leah Lavone. What do you think are the next steps we should take and be campaigning for in the light of the ruling that we are entitled to hold our gender critical views and that sex is binary and immutable? And which of our candidates would like to have a go at that one? Morgan, I think you were first in there.
I thought it was the only hand up at that point in time. So yes, look, there's no doubt that it's a great judgment, and it does give us a lot of ammunition. I think we do need to keep our eye on the re-tribunal, because that's another mountain that Maya has to climb. However, I think we can be much more open now in terms of stating our views, and where we get pushback and where we get abuse, we need to challenge that. We need to just keep challenging any abuse that we get within the party or outside the party, to be honest. And that's why I strongly believe that the National Women's Committee has to take the lead on making sure that the Labour Party is a safe place for women, alongside all of the other things that we've talked about need to happen. Much more women-focused democracy, getting rid of all of the hurdles there seem to be. I mean, I'm fairly new to this, but from where I sit, it's not a system that encourages participation. It's not a system that devolves decision-making to the grassroots. There's nothing but hurdles and boundaries and rules, and this is the way we do them, and this is the way we do that. And I think we need to start cutting through that, particularly through, if you like, the challenging that we can do now about any backlash we get about our stated beliefs. And in terms of moving forward, I think what I've seen in the mainstream media and what I've picked up from internal Labour forums is that they're treating this judgment like an anti-trans judgment. It isn't. It's a pro-women. We have now been told it's okay for us to speak our truth. And I'm not entirely sure we needed a court to tell us that. That should be self-evident, but it has. And I think that some of the tidy up work we need to do is to also challenge the fact that this is somehow anti-trans. This is pro-women's voices. This is pro-free speech. And I think those are the things that we need to challenge every time we see it come up.
Ruth.
Hi. Yeah, I think I agree with what has just been said. That's clear. There are some things that I want to say already, though. As I said, I'm a bit of a kind of, I don't know, there are two people who know me on this meeting. I'm a bit of a tank, yeah, sometimes. So it's kind of quite difficult to stop me from saying what I want to say. So I think one of the things to know for women is that it does actually say in the rule book that we may talk about controversial topics. And the only rule is that it shouldn't be personal and abusive. Yeah. So actually, this is part of our conditioning as women, that we get slapped back and we go, oh, all right then, and some of us are just more bolshy than others. So I have talked, and you can talk about these things. What you can't do is take it down to you. You're not allowed to say you are not a woman, you are not a man, your identity is ridiculous, whatever. You can't, that is abusive, and you can't do that. Likewise, they're not supposed to turn around and say you are so I think women, we often lack confidence in those kinds of situations. And that's one of the reasons for women's organising, that we build our confidence, we build our ability to speak in women-only meetings. Now, of course, some women-only meetings are not very friendly either, but that's the purpose of them, that you should be able to develop your ideas and you should be able to express your ideas without slinging insults. Yeah? So first of all, we are allowed to talk about it. Even before this ruling, we were allowed to talk about it. Secondly, this term gender critical, I mean, we use it a lot, but it's kind of been imposed on us a bit, I think, like most identities. I mean, it's a kind of, I'm a feminist. You know, gender critical is like I'm talking about one specific thing. Plus, gender has a variety of different meanings now, which it didn't have before. I mean, initially in feminism, we were talking about the system which oppresses women by ascribing gender roles to them, you know. So when we talk about, when feminists talk about gender, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody's feelings about their personal identity or self-image, yeah. So there's a lot of confusion about terms that I tend to just call myself a feminist. You know, feminists can speak. Feminists are allowed to say this is part of feminism. You know, critique of gender is part of feminism. It's not all of feminism. So, and the other problem with it is that you are getting on social media some right-wingers calling themselves gender critical. And you go and have a poke around their pages and they're not in the least bit gender critical. They are anti-trans, actually. You know, so what they want gender conformity, you know, even more than trans people support it. So actually they are not the same category as us. And I actually think this is why a lot of them are American and they're sort of fundamentalists. And I think that is why this argument is going better in England. So I think, again, to get back to actual strategies to deal with this, I think this thing of building the women's branches, networking the women's branches together, all of that is what it takes for us to develop our thinking, our self-expression, our ability to discuss without getting in a flap and, you know, sort of shouting and losing our, you know, rag on somebody not supporting us or whatever. I think we have the right to talk about anything. You know, that's the rule book. That's what it says.
Thanks, Ruth. Claudia, I think you wanted to speak.
I just wanted to add to the great points that have already been made that the Labour Party are currently, there is a group offering training to CLPs on what is transphobia. And I think we need to be very careful about any of the training that's already happening or any proposed training that the Labour Party intend to roll out. We need to make sure that it's updated now to address the new ruling that you know, being that the belief on gender that most of us as feminists hold is not to be discriminated against and is not transphobic. So I would like to see that done immediately as these proposals to roll out training on transphobia are current.
Right, thank you. That's anybody else for that one? Okay, fine. We've had a couple of questions about the work of women's officers, and we've got a couple with of our candidates have experience of that. So let's just ask this one, I think. This is from Cindy. As a women's officer in the CLP, I'm very frustrated at the difficulties I face in organising women members due to bureaucratic processes such as not being able to access and contact and communicate directly with women. And Kerry Ann added another question on that basis, which was also about the difficulties of dealing with unhelpful secretaries. So Ruth and Jen, I think you've both had experience. I don't know if you'd like to respond to those.
Yeah, I can say something on that. From any women's officer I've spoken to, the frustrations are exactly the same. I, in some ways, have been lucky with, say, CLP chairs and secretaries, in terms of, you know, getting, say, even just something as simple as getting emails out to the women members in the constituency, for example. I know in neighbouring constituencies, the women's officers are allowed nowhere near an email list. Even getting an email, sending it onto a chair and getting it out to the women seems to be an issue. And there's no connection between women's officers. So Berry's Greater Manchester, what I'd like to see is a connection of those women's officers and the branches in Greater Manchester that allows women's officers to meet up, and the organisers, well, any of us who are active really. I've asked regions several times, like, you don't need to send me the email addresses, but can you send something out to the women's officers? You must have a list of these women, you must, because this, when you're elected, the CLP sends through the roles to regional office. But again, this is something that I see for the national committee, through the regions down to the constituencies. This is a priority, because how do they know how many branches are set up and how many women are active and actually what they want to talk about, and if they can talk across, you know, other areas. When the first women's conference was in Telford, I know quite a few of you there. I went to the women's officer sort of, you know, sub meeting or whatever, and the room was far too small to fit anybody in it. And Charlotte Gerarda hosted it, and what she wanted from the meeting was a really positive, you know, sharing of experiences and, you know, that kind of thing. And it's not that the women didn't want that, but each one had a story about the hurdles they've had to jump just to be the women's officer and just to make it to the conference. We're not there yet, sort of, you know, to me, it wasn't there for her. And she looked really gutted about it. And to be honest, I'm not sure what she's done about it since. If we met in that room again in Telford, it would be the same thing, and we have to move forward, we have to make progress. Access to data, access to other women is really important part of this process, and the committee, it should be the priority for the committee in the first 2 years to set that up.
Right. I want to say that this is a problem that we've encountered. I think all women's branches have encountered, and it's absolutely infuriating. I mean, a branch, normally the secretary has access to organise. Right? Now, we know that how the computer system works. It will select the people in a particular area according to a field in the database. Selecting the women within the CLP should be easy. It should be one field in the database. The fact that they can't do this suggests that the data in the database is corrupted, right? And we know that it is corrupted because recently they messed it all up by mixing gender and sex together as one category, which it isn't, yeah? So now we know that instead it should be a matter of, you know, kind of almost flicking a switch with your algorithm, yeah? Well, it should be, that's all it is, yeah? But because they put in a 5-sector kind of field, you know, 5 possible answers field, we can't do that now. So this is actually typical of the structural discrimination that women meet. It's absolutely classic, yeah? And we absolutely must campaign to get this sorted out. We should all be writing, you know, I mean, every branch should be writing to say, we want this sorted and we want it sorted now. Because as I said, you constantly have to go through someone else to get it done. And yeah, again, in our CLP, our membership secretary is a member of the women's branch, and she's great, she cooperates. But in other places, it's not going to be like that. The first time I tried to get a letter out, but also, by the way, the CLP secretary can flick that switch, apparently. So there might be something else going on here. I mean, if they can send out to all these women, why can't the women's, actually, no, yeah, it's maybe not the data corruption. So it's actually deprioritizing the women's branches, isn't it? Okay, so that, you know, so that's ridiculous, yeah? And it's discrimination. So yeah, we can do it. I think another thing about this is it reflects something, I think, I'm not sure Jen mentioned it earlier, but we ought to have sort of regional organisation, that the women's conference ought to eventually lead to regional women's conferences, regional committees, at which this kind of problem is easier to solve, you know, because you can ask for all the women's officers in that region, so these things get more handleable. So I think that's another thing to do in the first few years of this committee, is to get that set up properly. Regional committees are great as well. Everybody knows that. You get to meet the people from the neighbouring CLPs and it's wonderful. So yeah, I think it's definitely the most ridiculous thing about the National Women's Organisation right now.
Can I just come in there, Ruth, because we've had a couple of questions around women's branches, and perhaps that just follows on from where you were saying here. Not everybody has a women's branch. How useful can the creation of those be?
Do you want me to answer that?
Whoever you, yes, go on, whoever you.
The women's branch has more, there are disadvantages as well. But the thing is, the women's forums have kind of dropped out of the rule book. So there's a problem there, because under women's forums, you were entitled to, the CLP was obliged to provide you with enough money for your activities, for sufficient money. But that has dropped out of the rule book now. So and how you manage the forum and so forth has all disappeared. So forums are effectively a relic. You don't actually have a kind of right to run a forum, I don't think, anymore. So that's one point. You need to turn into a branch. Secondly, what's the advantage of a branch? You can ask for money from your CLP for your campaigns, like we did recently. It's more like a normal, sort of regular branch. So yeah, you've got the same positions, the same training, people get experience, they can step up into positions in the CLP, they can, step up into positions in the branch with more confidence. Yeah, why did we switch to branches? So that we can have a conference, not a forum, not. That's it, that's my best answer, sorry.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Thank you for that. I'm going to switch to a different subject now. We've had a question from Judith and Anya. What can we do to get our Labour MPs and indeed our councillors to speak out about sex-based rights? Who would like to have a go at that one? Morgan.
I've usually got one answer to trying to make politicians do anything, and that is to direct action. That is to actually, I mean, like the stuff that's going on with stickers and ribbons, demonstrations, writing letters, any kind of direct campaigning action that we can carry out as a movement, I think gives them confidence to be able to speak out. I think the issue is that, who's that? I'm sorry, it's a bit random, but was that joke with that French leader of the revolution saying, "Oh, those are my people. I wonder where they're going. I must catch them up and get in front," or something. I think politicians do like to know where people want them to go. And if there are enough voices and you make enough noise, then it gives them cover. I mean, you all know this because you're already activists in one form or another. I think as well that having meetings with politicians in Chatham House rules if we have to, but where they can actually meet us and listen respectfully to our concerns and how we would like them to respond, and then to move that forward. There has to be some dialogue within the party between politicians and women like us who just don't agree with the direction of the party, and this kind of almost no platforming of any discussion, and the fear around that. So again, I'm a bit of a direct action kind of person. So we have to give them cover. We have to let them know that there's a big movement out here that will stand foursquare behind them, and call out the ones who are absolutely not just staying silent, but actually believe that the self-ID stuff is a good idea.
I can certainly feel direct action coming on. You know, as soon as lockdown's over, I think we're going to start seeing all kinds of things because there's been so much in the air of late. Claudia, you wanted to speak to this.
It's the few Labour MPs who do speak out have been given, you know, so much abuse on social media, and even I'm thinking of Rosie Duffield now, when Angela Rayner reprimanded her for something that she said that was in no way transphobic. I think we need to show our support when in those situations when the few you know, councillors or MPs who do speak out. We need to show our support, get behind them, show our support for them, and write to the party where to say that we are dismayed and shocked to see how they've been treated, and that they are you know, that their views are reasonable and should be heard.
Anybody else want to add to that one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, sort of bringing it back to the committee, it's important to note that the committee will be made up, there will be representation from the PLP on the committee. I think the PLP nominates somebody to attend, and I think that will be important for us, because I think women MPs would be interested to know what women members actually think through the committee and through, you know, the CLP representation. And I think that would give them confidence to, you know, speak out, or at least, do you know what I mean, or condemn where, you know, where appropriate, and drive the issue of this self-identity that's tearing the party apart, really. You know, give them the confidence that actually the women you are representing have, you know what I mean, have this view, and some of us are confident enough to say it. I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yes, Ruth. Ruth, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I think this is the place to add something. We're talking about getting women's views expressed and so forth, and we've also talked about interference by the structure of the party with women's expression and stuff. There is something else I spotted in the rule book last week about the women's committee, which is that the unions have about the conference, sorry, that the unions have, a union can have up to 25 delegates to the conference, and it's one delegate per 10,000 members, up to a maximum of 25. It makes no reference in the rule book to whether those members are women or not. So you can effectively sort of a male-dominated union can, you know, have a huge impact on the women's conference, which again is a sort of a way of structurally building in male dominance. So I think we need that clarified. That's another thing. You know, if we're going to talk about women's voices, are we sure these are women's voices that we're hearing? You know, and how far are the unions actually setting up women's branches to express women and sending women delegates who are expressing women's ideas? I mean, I think that's a sort of gaping great hole just slightly above the waterline there in the National Women's Organisation, which I think we ought to be examining closely.
Yeah, and just on that, you know, we do know that there's a policy review being undertaken. We know that you know, there's a new manifesto will be written. We need to find ways of ensuring that we are part of that process. And that's one of our last questions would be, how would you ensure about being on the National Women's Committee that women's voices do actually inform party policy? Who would like to answer that one for me? Claudia.
I think that the Women's Committee needs to have good lines of communication with the branches. I'm hoping that we're going to get lots of women's branches springing up now, and that there will be a constant communication between women's branches and women's committee, so that members of the committee would be given responsibility, hopefully, for a particular area, and they would be in contact with those branches, go and visit them, speak to them, and enable discussions to take place, and for those ideas to be fed back, so that the policy making processes are rooted in the ideas and the discussions that are taking place at that level, at grassroots level, with those women's branches.
Morgan.
And in some ways, flipping it on its head, now that we have a National Women's Committee, I think as community activists and political women, we now have a focus. We now have someone to hold to account if they are not doing the things that we need them to do in terms of women's democracy and engagement within the party, if they're not focusing on the issues that women in the CLPs at a grassroots level want them to focus on. So we can all actually influence the direction and the structuring of women's democracy in the party if we organise. And if we organise and we know what we want to achieve, we know what our women's committee should be doing, then we can also influence it the other way up. I don't think we should wait for anybody on that committee, because even if we all get elected to it, there are already rules in place about what the committee can do and what it can't do and all the rest of it. It's going to take 2 years, I think, to actually democratise the National Women's Committee and to give it any teeth at all within the party. And in the meantime, we can now coalesce around the ideas of how we want that committee to work, how we want it to lead the structural revolution within the party and build women's democracy with us at the grassroots.
Ruth. You're on mute, Ruth.
Pressing the wrong button to unmute there, sorry. What I would say is from my own experience, I mean, of setting up the Women's Forum, which was then transformed into the Women's Branch by the following Women's Officer, is early this year. I think we were one of the first ones that transformed. It's been a great sort of pleasure to actually produce motions at CLP level, and send them to conference is actually a real pleasure. I mean, people talk about empowering, this word is all over the place these days, empowering, but and they're usually talking about performing kind of patriarchally kind of recommended things better, rather than actually, power is actually access to political power and influence. And when I first joined the Labour Party, I was really surprised by how often CLPs and branches sort of passively receive motions from other organisations, like CLPD, ironically, and all kinds of unions, what have you, and they're sort of sending their motions. And I actually was the idiot that asked the question, don't we ever write any of the motions? And everyone kind of went, what? And I mean, so this year to conference, our women's branch has produced 2 motions which actually have gone into conference, but one of them via our neighbouring CLP and one from ours. And we produced them, and they're literally to do. One of them is about, it was triggered by a local crisis in midwifery, right? That we're 70 midwives short in Nottinghamshire, which kind of provoked a lot of kind of research, and then we found this, the problem about, and the news as well. We didn't find it. It was in the news about Black and ethnic minority women having 5 times the maternal death rate. So, these 2 things kind of fed into each other. And then it's a grassroots thing, isn't it? It's really about women on the ground. That's not something that's going to come out of a union. It's not going to, these are concerns for women who may not even be working, So that's the kind of motion that will come out at from ordinary members. And then another one that we put in was the bereavement support. We didn't put it in because we've only put one in, of course, you can only put one in, but our neighbouring CLP put in the bereavement support payments thing because we have a member who works on that campaign, and you know, she talked to us about it. And again, it's one of those campaigns that it mainly concerns women. The vast majority of widows are women, apparently because men don't look after themselves very well. So, you know, again, where would the motion like that emerge from if not a CLP? So the important thing was for us to learn to write a motion and, you know, get it down to 250 words and what the process is to get it in. So I would like to see that kind of work in the, you know, less passivity, less waiting for, you know, momentum to send us something. Or, you know, as I said, I voted for all that stuff, but I did feel more empowered by producing this stuff rather than waiting for it. So that's what I would like to see other women feel. It's a great experience.
I just want to come in there to say that in my CLP, we wrote our own motion and it was brilliant, but then we didn't know where to send it. Basically, having a motion actually impact on the party's systems and party policy is a whole other subject. You know, it was a useful process in itself and a great discussion, but, you know, it really having a thought through way of impacting on policy seems to me to be an absolute priority, really, because however many discussions we have, if we don't have that follow through, then they're not going anywhere, really. Now I'm going to ask each of the candidates to do just a final short statement, please, from each of you. Anything you'd just like to add?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah, I'll do it. I was just going to respond to that question, but I'll do it in this summing up. I know I've spoken a lot about the practicalities. Regardless of whether I'm successful or not, I'm going to keep going with what I'm doing, which is as a women's officer, contacting other women in the party, be that officers, as part of the region, whatever that is, and challenging the committee, as Morgan has spoken about, to, you know, to get on with enabling women to meet, discuss, debate, self-organise, all of that. I'm going to just keep going anyway. But on the committee itself, is such an important 2 years. Like, setting up something new sets a standard, doesn't it? And it sets a tone. And I think all of us actually have a responsibility to challenge that and ensure that it happens for women. And I think through the likes of Labour Women's Declaration and the other, you know, and various other organisations for women in the party, that's something that I, you know, will push for, really. I as I said before, I'd see no point of a committee just made up of all the same slate and include the unions within a lot of that thinking, because it's not only not representing our issue here, the Labour Women's Declaration kind of issue, it's not representing the rest of the party either, is it? If you look at them, like we've talked about, the same motions that come forward because it's written by Momentum or CLPD or, you know, whoever, and the same women coming forward time after time, and we've got so much talent and experience out there in the party, and that really needs to come forward. Someone had mentioned about places without women's branches, and they're absolutely right. The women I'm trying to find aren't necessarily the most organised ones with, you know, branches set up and lots of roles. I'm trying to find the women who are frustrated in their local party and not really sure what to do and where to turn, and that's exactly the women that the committee should be set up for, to help that happen. So yeah, from my perspective, you know, I really want to get on this committee and you know, get going. But if I don't, I'm going to be doing this anyway. Do you see what I mean? And I hope the women on the call will also, do you know what I mean? We'll join in, and actually. We do have sort of policy concerns, but we have really practical concerns to tackle. And I think as a group of women like all of us here, I think that's possible. So I just want to say thank you for listening to what I've got to say, and it's brilliant being part of this call, and the other candidates are absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much.
Ruth, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I think I want to make this point that I think the women's section has massive potential in the party, and again, that's from my personal experience. Once we had difficulty getting in touch with women to set up our first women's forum meeting. We had difficulty getting them there in the first place, finding something that would be inviting for people to turn up to. So what I'm going to say to you is, don't say just come and meet us. People won't do that. You have to have something to do. Otherwise, just come and meet us, have a social. Doesn't work. But once you get it up and going, I mean, like for example, in our CLP, the women's is definitely the most lively and the best bit. And they've even said in the CLP, oh, the women's section is putting us to shame. So, I mean, it really is a great thing to do. I back everything that Jen said about carrying on, helping people set up branches everywhere, because I just think a network is always more powerful than, one blob, whatever. My background is in training and education, adult training and education. And so for me, that sort of enabling adults to do what they want, but not children. I mean, it's like you don't talk to adults like they're children, So enabling adults to sort of get free and do what they want and, act is exciting. But also I think there's huge political potential amongst women, especially right now, because we've seen how women have been pushed so far backwards, both by austerity and by COVID. It's been devastating for women's employment and opportunities. And also the outcome of Brexit is likely to be very negative for women over the next couple of years. So I think at this point, women will be starting to think really clearly about themselves as an oppressed class. I think that's not going to take very long. Yeah.
Thanks, Ruth. Morgan.
I would like to see all of my colleagues elected to the National Women's Committee. I'm also standing as Women's Officer in my CLP, and if I get elected, I'm going to push to form a branch and build networks and join in with all the other exciting women's democracy that is available to us to push for. I'm going to misquote Margaret Mead now. Never doubt that a small group of committed women can change the world, because it is actually the only thing that ever has. So, women, commit to the struggle. Courage calls to courage. Let's do stuff.
Brilliant. And Claudia, do you want to come in on that? Hard to follow.
Yeah, hard to follow. But what I'd like to say, first of all, is thank you very much to Labour Women's Declaration for the help and support they've given us as independent candidates and organising this meeting, which has brought delegates and candidates together, where we've been able to have some really good discussions. And thank you everybody who's attended this call on a beautiful day. I don't know if it is beautiful where you are, but it certainly is here. And also, if you haven't signed the Labour Women's Declaration yet, please do sign it and sign up to the emails. Labour Women's Declaration Working Group are doing fantastic work. I just think it's just amazing how we can see things are starting to change now. So please stick with it, stick with us, and let's stick together. I have great hopes. I'm an optimist, so I do have great hopes for women's organising in the Labour Party, and we have our work cut out, that's for sure. But I know how much we can achieve when we work together, supporting each other and united in our shared aims for women's equality and defending women's rights in the Labour Party and beyond. So have a great women's conference, everybody. And let's make sure that women are at the centre of the Labour Party, because that is the only way that we are going to win another election. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. I just want to say I feel really inspired by listening to you today. It's just been it's just re-galvanized me with the possibility of what women can do when we do come together and organize. And everybody must vote for you. You're just so brilliant. But I just want to mention a couple of more things, which is speak to your delegates about our candidates. And if you are a delegate, please get in touch with Labour Women's Declaration, because we can put delegates together. And I think that might be a very helpful process. And secondly, that as Labour Women's Declaration, we will be arranging a private backroom meeting at the National Conference in Brighton. So if any of you are planning to come to that, it'd be a lovely place to just network and to meet each other in real life and to organise. So please look out for that if you're planning to come to Brighton. I'm not sure now if we're opening for a little bit more general wild discussion or whether we really have come to an end, because it's 5:20 now. And we did say we'd stop before 5:30, but can somebody else tell me what?
There was one comment about how do you set up a women's branch, and I was thinking perhaps if I turned off the recording now, anyone might be able to speak just for another 10 more minutes.